I noticed that there was a couple of letters that were very, very. It was kind of hard to. It's kind of hard to see some of the letters, but today we are actually, since Pesach is this Shabbat. Today we're going to kind of go off script, off our Parsha section, and we are going to talk about Pesach. Now, as I've mentioned so many times before, that, and again, I don't say this as a joke, but I do say it seriously, that there's two things about me that you can't contradict. There's two things about me that you cannot say I am wrong in. I am not wrong. I am absolutely 100% right. You cannot contradict me. And the first one is that I don't know everything. The second one is that while we may all be wrong, we can't all be right. No, those two, how could you contradict those two statements? They're true about every one of us. Not only are they true about me, but they're true about each person here. They're true about every book written, except the scriptures. They're true about every preacher on TV. Always remember, when you're watching TV, or when you're in, especially the internet, that whoever's saying something, always remember, they don't know everything. And while they all may be wrong, while we all together, everybody might be wrong, we cannot all be right. There will be some people that are right and some people that are wrong. In fact, there will be people that are righter and people that are wronger. Can we use that? Is that good, bad English? And so it's important for us to have a degree of humility when we teach. Not arrogance. Not the arrogance that every graduate from Bible school or seminary, or you get your doctorate, and the arrogance that says, I know everything. There's all kinds of people that have the arrogance and that I know everything. Well, we don't know everything, and while our youth makes us think that we know everything, as we preach for 1 year, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, the more and longer we preach, the more we realize that we don't know everything. And it's okay to tell people that we don't know everything. And always remember, it's for a young Bible school graduate, it's kind of hard to tell people I don't know everything. But once you realize that you really don't know everything, then it gets easier to say, you know what, I don't know everything. But I do know some things. And I do study and I do research. And so one of the things that I really want to make sure that we all do here is, in this congregation, when you walk out the door, in 5 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, those babies that are over here, and I just love to see the babies, especially when they don't know what we're talking about, but the Spirit of Yahweh is entering them and speaking to them. And they're holding the scrolls here, and they don't know why they're up here. But I love to see them because this is who we're talking to. All of us here, when we stand here talking to them and you guys stand behind them, you're supporting them. This is the generation that needs to know these things. So the first thing I want to, and again, those of you that come on Wednesday nights and have studied with us for some time, you know these things. And so this is, what we're going to talk today is kindergarten stuff. Is it okay to teach kindergarten stuff? Because every so often we need to be reminded of 2 plus 2, ABC, and we need to be reminded of those things. Plus, there might be, how many of you, this will be your first year with a Passover Messianic? Okay, one. Okay, a few back there, several back there. So I want to make sure that we all come to that and start at the beginning, So the first scripture I want to lead you to this morning is the book of Bereshit, Genesis, chapter 1, verse 14. And in Bereshit chapter 1, 14, this is on creation week, when Adonai created the world. And in verse 14, which is on the fourth day, Elohim said, "Let there be lights in the vault of heaven to divide day from night. Let them indicate festivals, days, and years. Let them be lights in the vault of heaven to shine on the earth." And so it was. Elohim made the 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the smaller light to govern the night, and the stars also. And Elohim set them in the vault of heaven to shine on the earth, to govern the day and the night, to divide light from darkness. And Elohim saw that it was good. Evening came, and morning came, the fourth day. The earth had been spinning around in darkness, with the exception of the ethereal light that he had created on the first day. But now he actually makes what we call the stars. He creates what we call the sun and the moon on the fourth day of the earth's spin. Now, of course, it was spinning for 4 days in what we call now, if you wear a watch, a 24-hour period. So we've already had 3 24-hour spins, and this is on the 4th spin of a 24-hour period. And so Adonai here creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. And the purpose of the sun and moon and stars, it says, is to indicate days and years. And I want to remind you that a day is 1 spin of the earth in what we call a 24-hour period. So every time the earth spins 1 time, it's 1 day, 24 hours. What a month is when the moon does 1 spin around the earth. That's a month. In Hebrew, Chodesh, that's called a moon. In Hebrew, the word month and moon are the same word. So in Hebrew, if you say 2 months from now, you're actually saying 2 moons from now. Or many moons means many months. And that's Hebraic thought. That's Hebraic native talk. And a year is when the earth spins around the sun 1 time. So we have the earth spin, the moon spin, and the earth spinning around the sun. And this is our calendar. This is the calendar that Adonai gave us. He actually gave us these astronomical bodies, and these bodies become the biblical calendar. Notice here in verse 14 where it actually says that not only should they divide night and day, but let them be to indicate. And we said last week, indicate means to point to the festivals, the days, and the years. So they're pointers, otot in Hebrew plural. Let them be indicators, let them be pointers to indicate festivals. The first word is festivals. Well, wait a second. There are no festivals here. In fact, this is only the fourth day. Man even hasn't been created yet. And then Adonai makes the calendar, the astronomical calendar, to indicate, to point to what? To festivals that will be given. Now, definitely the festivals are going to be shown to us exactly in Leviticus 23. Last week I told you, make sure you know Leviticus 23 like the back of your hand. Everyone here should be familiar with Leviticus 23. I should be able to go to everyone's Bible and say, let me see your Leviticus 23, and your Leviticus 23 should be all marked up and underlined and in yellow and with little stars and all kinds of stuff like that. If it's not, then let's get to it. But it says here, let them indicate festivals. The word for festival there in the plural is moedim. Moedim. And the word festival, and to us, a feast, a festival, usually indicates food or indicates something of a carnival atmosphere. Well, that's not what the Hebrew word is about. The Hebrew word moedim, or moed in the singular, indicates an appointed time, a specific time, a time that has to do with our interaction with Adonai. It's interesting that the Greek actually has two words for time, for festival, for a holiday or holy day, as we say. And their words are chronos, where we get the word chronology, time as chronology, that kind of calendar. But the Greek also has the word kairos. And kairos time, apart from chronos time, is that time that is specific with Adonai, and it's an appointed time. At the right time, Adonai sent Messiah to die for sinful man. Do you know that Yeshua died at the appointed time, at the right time? He died at the moed. Now, Genesis gives us, these are the moedim. The sun and the moon are for the moedim. This is how you indicate Adonai's timing. And this is all about Yeshua. This verse here is about Yeshua. You could actually see Yeshua in this verse. He set the sun and the moon to indicate Yeshua, to indicate the moedim. Because the moedim are about Yeshua. Every moed, every appointed time, every feast of Yahweh, every festival, it's about Yeshua. It's not about eating. It's not about carnival frivolity. It's not about all the preparations. It's about Yeshua. Yeshua is the moed. Yeshua is the time. He is the right time. At the chosen moment, at the appointed time, at the moed, the kairos. Adonai sent Yeshua, and he died for sinful men. And we're going to find out that that is Passover day. Yeshua died on Passover day. In fact, Yeshua is our Passover. We are specifically told, and we'll look at this week, and next week we'll even get more into this, but we're specifically told that Yeshua is our Pesach. He is the lamb that was sacrificed. With the blood of Yeshua put on the doorposts of our house, of our soul. And that blood of Yeshua, when the angel of death comes, Yahweh is going to come in between the angel of death and us. And all of a sudden, as Adonai passes over us and he sees the blood, he will protect us from the angel of eternal death, and he will give us everlasting life. Can you feature that? Adonai has started that way back here in Genesis. The festivals, the Moedim. Now, if you go to Leviticus 23, which we're going to be actually working with in a week or so, I just want to take you there just for a second. And we're only going to look at the first couple of verses there in Leviticus 23. In a week or so, we're going to go through the whole thing. But verse 1, Yahweh spoke to Moshe and he said, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the Moedim of Yahweh. Please underline that. The Moedim of Yahweh. The solemn festivals, the appointed times, different translations, the seasons of Yahweh. Whatever your Bible says there. In the Hebrew, it's the Moedim of Yahweh. And again, to make sure we understand this, these are not the feasts of the Jews. These are not even the feasts of Israel. Although Israel has been made the caretaker of the Moedim, they're Yahweh's Moedim. They're Yahweh's appointed times. They're his festivals, his feasts. And when all of Israel broke up, Yehuda became the primary caretakers of the Moedim. So today when we say the Jews, we're talking about the tribe of Yehuda, who are now the primary caretakers until Adonai sets up the kingdom through Messiah Yeshua, and all 12 tribes will again be the caretakers, and again the Torah shall come forth out of Jerusalem, and the word of Adonai, the word of Yahweh, out of Sion in the 1,000 years. The Moedim of Yahweh, to which you summon them, are Mikra Kodesh. The Moedim, the appointed times which you summon them. Remember, we were talking here several weeks ago about a summons. If you receive a summons from the judge that says, appear here or else, you better appear. You are being summoned. The Moedim are actually summons. So every one of you here are summoned to the Moedim. More importantly, since we're talking about Pesach, every one of you is summoned to Pesach. If you are a believer in Yahweh, you are summoned to Pesach. You are summoned to be part of Pesach. And he says, these are also Mikra Kodesh. The word Mikra is the word for a meeting, for a convocation, for an assembly. And it's a Mikra Kodesh, a holy assembly, a holy convocation. Right now, we're having a holy convocation. We're being summoned here. And we are in convocation right now. We were summoned to come and study Torah. We're summoned to praise Him. And we're summoned to come and be part and present ourselves before Yahweh every Sabbath. By the way, every Sabbath we are summoned to be here. We're not summoned to be other places. We're not summoned to be at work. And again, we're living in a transition time that sometimes in our exile, and we are under different circumstances, but biblically and ideally, we are summoned to be here. By the way, apart from work, which has to do with your family, and in our world today, this is not the day for baseball practice or football practice. And here's an area that the children need to learn to respect the Sabbath. If we teach our children we can't have baseball or football practice on Shabbat, and the coach says, well, then they're out of the team, those children need to learn that being out of the team is not as bad as being out of Adonai's will. And it's more important, and this is how they learn. If we are soft on them and soft on the world, then they're going to grow up, well, I could, as many of us adults, it's easier for us adults to say, well, Adonai understands, which he doesn't. But it's easy for us to say, because growing up, we weren't taught the seriousness of the Moedim. We weren't taught the seriousness of the Sabbath. In fact, we were not even taught the Sabbath, but even when we went to Sunday church, we could miss it if we want to, and no consequences. But see, if we miss the Sabbath, there are consequences. There are consequences to missing the Sabbath, unless it's an emergency or something happens. We understand that sickness, that's no problem. But we're talking here about missing Sabbath or even Sunday because we have other things to do. Our own pleasure. Remember Adonai said, don't do your own pleasure on the Sabbath? Well, a lot of people, we grew up thinking that, well, if we miss a Sunday, it's okay. It's not that bad of a deal. Now, before it was a big deal if you miss Sunday, especially those of you that come from a Catholic perspective, which is more biblical than the Protestant. By the way, the Catholic Church follows in some areas things that are more biblical than Christianity. And that's one of the areas because that comes from a Hebraic Shabbat perspective. And we need to balance ourselves out there. These are Mikra Kodesh. These are convocations where you're summoned. They're holy meeting. This is a holy meeting. This is not a club meeting. We're not in a club. This is a holy, set apart meeting. Another word for mikra is the word rehearsal. So right now we're rehearsing. Well, what are we rehearsing? We're rehearsing two things. We're rehearsing the millennial kingdom. That's going to be a 1,000-year rehearsal for the eternal kingdom, which is going to be an everlasting Shabbat. Can you imagine an everlasting Shabbat? The loved ones that have gone home to be with Adonai, they're in their everlasting Shabbat. My mom that went home almost a year ago, she's in her everlasting Shabbat. Lester, your beloved wife, everlasting Shabbat. In Arturo, everlasting Shabbat. Everyone, our brother, everlasting Shabbat, everlasting Shabbat. Our loved ones, they are in peace, they are in shalom. They are really receiving and having Shabbat shalom. They're having a good shalom. To which you summon them are sacred assemblies. These are my Moedim. And then he goes on talking about the Sabbath first, and then the 7 other, we'll go on those next week. Go with me to Exodus chapter 12. Oh, and before you go there, here, it says there in verse, in Leviticus, the first one is on verse, 5? On the 14th is the Passover, and the 15th is the day of unleavened bread. So here in verses 4, 5, and 6, we are told about the first two moeds, the first two moedim, the first two feasts. On the 14th of the month, remember the month starts, and let's go to Exodus 12 now. And Exodus 12 will give us the chronology. And here in Exodus 12, verse 1, Yahweh said to Moshe and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this moon, or this month, is to be the first of all others for you, the first moon of your year. And then on the third verse, on the 10th day of this month, each man must take an animal from the flock. And then in verse 6, you must keep it till the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the community of Israel shall slaughter it between the two evenings. Now, Leviticus 23 tells us the 14th is the Passover of Yahweh. The 15th is the day of unleavened bread, the first day of unleavened bread, and there are 7 days of unleavened bread. So there's 1 day of Passover, one Passover, and 7 days of unleavened bread. The 15th is a minor Shabbat, and the 21st, the 7th day, is another minor Shabbat. They are not full Shabbats, but they are minor Shabbats. The Shabbat of Shabbaton, the Sabbath of Sabbath, is Yom Kippur. That is the Sabbath of Sabbath. And then we have seventh-day Sabbath throughout the year. And then we have what I call minor Sabbaths. In fact, a lot of people call them high Sabbaths, but I don't know where they get the term high Sabbath, because they are not higher than the seventh-day Sabbath. In fact, they are lower than the seventh-day Sabbath, because all it says on those days is that you shall do no servile work. You shall do no heavy work. It doesn't say you shall keep it as a complete Sabbath, as we will look at that next week. But it says here that on the first day of the month, that's the beginning of the year, which was last Wednesday, our first month of the year began. On the 10th day, is the day you select the lamb. You select the lamb, and it actually says any day, any time. Doesn't even tell you when. Just says on the 10th day, select the lamb. And it gives you ideas of what the lamb is and all those that we've already talked about. But in verse 6, it says you will keep it until the 14th day. So from the 10th day, you will keep it till the 14th day. The 14th day, and in Hebrew, and there was evening and morning, Yom Echad, and there was evening and morning the first day. There was evening and morning the second day. There was evening and morning the third day. Evening and morning the fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, seventh day. And from creation, we've had evening and morning up to today. How many of you had evening last night? How many had morning this morning? And as Adonai wills, we'll have evening tonight and morning on the morrow. That's the way it's always been. Think of it. It's always been that way. That will never change. Doesn't matter what man has done. And the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, everybody has when the 24-hour day starts. Today, we start the 24-hour day midnight to midnight. And the international dateline is in the Pacific. But that doesn't matter to Adonai. It doesn't matter what games or what people play. Adonai has his international dateline in Jerusalem. And his day begins in the evening. So you keep it till the evening of the 14th day, where you will sacrifice it between the two evenings. It says between the two evenings. In most Bible, it says where you will sacrifice it at twilight or at dusk. Well, those again are terms. The biblical term is between the two evenings. What is the two evenings? The two evenings is when the sun sets at your horizon, the sun sets, and that ends the last day. And then when the sun sets over in the sea, you could actually call it the maritime sunset, when it gets dark enough that the stars come out. Because remember, when the sun sets, it's still light, right? And you can't see the stars. But between the time sets in your horizon, and if you live on Sandia Park on the other side, or you live on this side of the mountain, it'll be different times. But when the sun is actually way over and sets astronomically, and you start looking up, it starts getting dark, and you start looking up, and in the clear light, you could send the kids, because they love to do this. You send the kids out and look for the stars. Who sees the first star? I'll give a Snickers to whoever sees the first star. And all of a sudden, I see the first star, I see the first star. I see another one here. And once you have two stars, by the mouth are two or three witnesses, everything is established. So when you see two stars, hey, it's the second evening. When you see the third star, confirmation, it's evening. It's the next day already. So that time in between, and again, different times of the seasons, it'll be different. And I would encourage you, get a stopwatch today. Get you a stopwatch, or some of your phones have stopwatches, or get your watch and wait till sunset. As soon as it goes over the mesa, start counting and counting. And like always, beg, borrow, or steal a couple of kids, and have them there around looking for the stars. And when they catch the first one, the second one, the third one, and see how long that took. Every day might take several seconds, different. Every season will be different by several minutes. But that in-between time is a very special time. Because that is the time when Adonai said, in Goshen, you will sacrifice them. You will take that lamb that you chose on the 10th day, on the 14th day between the two evenings, as the 14th begins. As the 14th begins, you will sacrifice them between those two evenings, And then that day, as the 14th begins, for 24 hours, it'll be Passover. For 24 hours, it'll be the Passover. And so you will eat the Passover that night. They ate it in Goshen that night. And that next day was the Passover day. Yeshua did the same thing. Yeshua told his disciples to go prepare the Passover. Go prepare the Passover. And they prepared the Passover, and they got it, and they sacrificed it. They brought it, roasted it right outside what we call the upper room. And that night, on the 14th, at the beginning of the 14th, they ate it, and by 2, 3 in the morning, they went to Gethsemane. And in Gethsemane, by the way, did you know there's a Bible contradiction there? One gospel writer says they went to Gethsemane. Another gospel writer says they went to where there was an olive oiled tree, little forest, little grove. Well, a lot of people say, well, this guy says Gethsemane, this guy says the olive oil grove. Well, there's a contradiction. Yeah, but you don't know Hebrew. What does Gethsemane mean? The place of the olive press. So that was where they got the olives. It was an olive grove, and they pressed the olive, and that's where they pressed them. A little bit of Hebrew clears up a lot of supposed contradictions. But Yeshua ate the Passover. They went to Gethsemane, and he was praying and trying to wake his disciples up. They would not be awoken. And then he was arrested on Passover morning. He was arrested on Passover morning. And at 9 o'clock on Passover day, he was crucified. At 12 o'clock on Passover day, the sky turned dark. And at 3 p.m. on Passover day, Yeshua gave up the ghost. Now at 9 o'clock in the morning, when he was crucified, was the very hour that they sacrificed the Lamb of sin for Israel. At 3 o'clock p.m. was when they sacrificed a second lamb for sin for Israel. So Yeshua was crucified and died at the time of the 2 sin offerings for Israel. And he died, and then between 3 p.m. and right before the beginning of the next day, we know that they brought him down from the cross. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus requested the body. They got the body. They performed a tahara. One of the reasons why we perform tahara is because this was the biblical form of burial of the dead. It's called tahara, meaning cleansing. And many people come and visit us, and they wonder, what are those 2 boxes in the back for? Those 2 boxes in the back are caskets. And these caskets are available for those of you that would need one for a family member. Because in Hebraic thought, what you do when someone dies, the first thing you do is you wash the body. And Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, both secret disciples of Yeshua until this time. Their cover was blown. But now they do the tahara, and it says they did the ritual washing of the body. So we are actually told by the gospel writer that they did a tahara. And they put Yeshua, wrapped him up in cloth, in linen. Today we use wooden caskets. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. We do not use metal. We will not use a metal casket here. We will only use wood. Or, preferably, if your cemetery allows it, for the body just to be put in the grave with no casket, just wrapped up in linen or a blanket. That is the biblical way of doing it. That's the way it's done in Israel, even with no casket. But here, again, because of culture, many times people want a casket. And so Yeshua's body was prepared. They put him on the bier, and they took him to Joseph of Arimathea's unused tomb. You see, in biblical times, they would prepare their own tomb. Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, probably commissioned someone to prepare his tomb, which again, it was unused because he was alive. So because of that, they put Yeshua's body in the tomb, and as they put him in the tomb, guess what time it was? The sun had set, and it was between the two evenings. And as they put him in the tomb, and they rolled the stone, and the Romans came and put a seal on it, it was the 15th of Aviv, the first day of unleavened bread had come in. So Yeshua actually died. Not only did he have his Passover meal on the beginning of Pesach, but he died on the day of Pesach, at the time of the lamb being killed for the sin sacrifice. And Yeshua was buried on the day of unleavened bread. Rabbinically, today, and the Pharisees in Yeshua's day actually would do the Passover at the end of the 14th. And they actually ate the Passover on the 15th. So when they were eating Passover, they were not eating Passover on Passover night. They were eating Passover on the first day of unleavened bread. But the ancient original Hebrew calendar separated between Passover and unleavened bread. Again, today, if you go to a rabbinic congregation, they will have Passover at the end of the 14th, and actually be eating the Passover on the 15th. They've actually combined it to be one holiday season of 7 days, not 8 days, but 7 days. And so that's the way it is today at Chabad or any of the rabbinic times. Again, they follow several other additions, like they follow the conjunction. So their year and their month begins at the conjunction of the moon and the sun, whereas biblically they would do at the first sighting of the crescent moon, which appears on the western horizon right after sundown. So when the sun goes down at the first day of the month, you will see the crescent moon coming up, and it'll rise, and then it'll go down. It'll rise, and then there'll be a moon rise and a moon set within a 10, 15-minute period, again, depending on the season. So we begin our Passover 14 days after the beginning of the new moon of Aviv, and we do it at the beginning of the 14th of the month. And so Yeshua died on Passover, but he was buried on unleavened bread. Yeshua could not have died on Passover and buried on unleavened bread if they were one holy day, like the rabbis have today. Those are two separate days. 14th is the Passover. The 15th is the day of unleavened bread. Well, Yeshua died on the 14th. He had to have died on the 14th. He could not have died on the 15th. Yeshua did not die on the 15th. He died on the 14th. But on the 15th, he was buried. So as they buried him on the 15th, the day that Yeshua did his Passover was what we would call a Tuesday night. Tuesday night was the beginning of the 14th. That means that Wednesday day was Passover day. So Yeshua died on a Wednesday at 3 p.m. But that night, what we call Wednesday night, was when the 15th began. But in Hebrew, that next day would have been a Thursday. So that Thursday was the first day of unleavened bread, which the 15th is a minor Shabbat. That's the first day of unleavened bread, and that's a day that we don't do any work. That's the day that you will have a sacred meeting. And by the way, it also says what? 3 times a year, all the men are to assemble. So the 15th is a day of assembly for the menfolk. That's one of the only words that I like from the King James Version, the menfolk. That sounds nice, doesn't it? The menfolk. The menfolk, by the way, the King James also calls ants folk, and calls them a people. Anyway, that's another story. But the menfolk are to appear before Adonai 3 times a year. At unleavened bread, at Shavuot, Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, and at Sukkot, at Tabernacles. And so one of the things that we have here is that Yeshua died on Passover day. But that as he was buried at the beginning between the 2 evenings of unleavened bread. The night of unleavened bread. And the next day, all the men met. The Temple Mount must have been filled with all kinds of people. And remember, that night that Yeshua was buried begins the time clock again, another of 72 hours. Now again, that's another situation that we have in modern Christianity. You have your Good Friday-ers and you have your Good Wednesday-ers. We are a Good Wednesday people because traditionally Friday is the day of preparation for the Sabbath. Friday is the day of preparation for the Sabbath. And so Yeshua died on preparation day. So because he died on preparation day, and because Friday was a day of preparation, people got the idea that he died on Friday. But remember, Yeshua said, in fact, let's go to Matthew, a scripture that most of you already know, but one that everybody needs to write down. Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. For as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. If this verse would not have been here, I would have no problem with a Good Friday death for Yeshua. Because in rabbinic thought, any part of the day is a full day. Any part of the year is a full year. In some Egyptian writings, a pharaoh could be a pharaoh for 3 years. He was pharaoh for 3 years. But he became pharaoh on December 30th. And he was pharaoh for 365 days. After that, he was pharaoh for another 5 days, and he died on January 5. So he was a year and 5 days here, a year and 5 days here. They would say that he was pharaoh for 3 years, which means that you have overlap of pharaohs. One of the reasons for we're having problems dating Egyptian chronology is because of that. And if you have overlaps, then you have all these pharaohs. And if we go by our clock, by our chronology, 3 years here, 10 years there. Wait a second, that's a long time. But if you know that these 3 years, he was only pharaoh 1 year and 10 days, not 3 years. But see, that's not what we're looking at here. When it says on the third day, on the third day, you could use that type of thinking. But Yeshua here, and I know a lot of people say, well, wait, Yeshua was a man of his times. He wasn't a modern chronologer. Yeah, but Yeshua over here says what? For as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. A simple third grader could tell you that Friday at sundown to Sunday morning is not 3 days and 3 nights. Even if we don't say it has to be 37 hours, that's 37 hours. And we're not talking about, but 3 days and 3 nights is not 37 hours, it's actually 72 hours. So Yeshua was put in the grave on what we call Wednesday night, which is the beginning of the 15th. So he's in the grave on Wednesday night. He's in the grave on Thursday day. That makes 1 night, 1 day. And he's in the grave 3 nights and 3 days, which means that on the end of Friday, as the sun is setting and it hits, and then the new day begins at the 3 stars, that ends the 72 hours. And so Yeshua rises from the dead on what we call Saturday night. He rises from the dead on what we call Saturday night. Not Sunday morning, but Saturday night. And then they say, well, what about Mary? They came, and in the morning and they talked to Yeshua. He rose in the morning. No, there's never a place in the Gospels that says that he resurrected in the morning. In fact, it says that Mary Magdalene and the other Marys came while it was still dark. Notice it says while it was still dark. And they actually came 2 times. They didn't come once. They actually came 2 times. They came while it was still dark. And then they went and told the disciples, and then they came back. And while it was still dark, could be any time in the morning before sunrise. Mary actually gets there the second time again after sunrise, and that's when she talks to Yeshua after sunrise, and she says to him, where have you laid him? And when he says, Miriam, Mary, Rabboni, and she goes to grab him and says, do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. That was the day of Bekurim. That was the day when the first fruit of the barley, this represents the first fruit, the first omer of the barley, and at 9 o'clock in the morning, at the time of the morning sacrifice, 3 days later after Yeshua had been crucified, the priest would raise up with a gesture of offering, slowly raise the first fruits and wave it before Adonai and say, Adonai, as you have given us this barley, we rise it before you, we know you're going to give us the rest of the barley. So Yeshua actually died on Passover day. Yeshua actually rose on the first, Yeshua was actually buried on the first day of unleavened bread. And Yeshua was actually risen on the day of Bekurim. Right when the priest was offering that up, Yeshua was raising to the Father. Remember, he had already risen from the grave at night. But he was, in a sense, still here because he talks to Mary and he says to Mary, don't touch me, for I have not arisen to the Father. And so at 9 o'clock on Bekurim, on Resurrection Day, what we call Resurrection Day today, Bekurim in Hebrew, he goes to the Father and presents his blood, presents himself as the risen victor over sin and death. Yahweh accepts it, the Father accepts it, and the sin of the world is paid for. Think of it. The sin of every person in the whole world has been paid by Yeshua. Hitler's sin was paid by Yeshua. Saddam Hussein's sin was paid by Yeshua. Sister Teresa's sin was paid by Yeshua. Everybody's sin here was paid by Yeshua. Every person that has ever lived, from Adam to the last people, every person. 100% payment for every sin in the world was paid. And it was a done deal. It was accomplished. But the chronology is of importance. And the chronology has to be that Yeshua died on Passover day. He was buried on the first day of unleavened bread. And he rose again on the day of Bekurim. And so we follow that chronology here. That is the ancient biblical chronology. Of course, today, because of apparent, and underline that word, or apparent contradictions, a couple of the major apparent contradictions are the synoptics and the Gospel of John. The synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're called synoptic because what does the word optic mean? Vision or eyes, see. Sin, S-Y-N, in Greek means together or with. So synoptic means they see the same thing, or we see the same thing. So when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you kind of see the same thing in all three of them. John's gospel is totally different. It begins different. It doesn't have a lot on the birth and death narratives of Yeshua. It only mentions certain things. But the other gospels say Yeshua ate the Passover and he died. John's gospel says something very tricky. It says that when Yeshua was being interrogated by the Romans, the chief priests did not want to come into the praetorium because they want to be unclean for the Passover. Oh, wait a second. I thought the Passover had just occurred. Yeshua did the Passover meal. He died on, that was Wednesday. He was a Passover day. Well, why are they going to eat the Passover? And these apparent contradictions have caused people to say, no, it was this. You have your synopticers, and then you have your Johners. And your synopticers say it was Passover. Your Johners say, no, the Passover is the next day. But again, these are what I call apparent contradictions. One of the reasons why, and I want to say this again with all humility, because we don't know everything. You know what? I wish we knew Hebrew and Greek like the back of our hands. But I wish we knew the Hebrew and Greek of the first century. You see, because not only is it knowing Greek and Hebrew, which is important, but it's knowing the Greek and Hebrew of the first century. Because there's idioms that we don't know about. You know, you could use an idiom and some people will get it and some people won't if they don't know the idiom. And sometimes when you translate an idiom into another language, you even get in trouble. Because when you translate an idiom, a way of saying things, an illustration, into another language, from Hebrew to Greek, from Greek to Latin, from Latin to English, now you're getting further and further away, and you could even test this yourselves. Write something in English, and have somebody translate it from English to Spanish. Then get the Spanish and give it to someone else and have them translate it from Spanish back to English. Well, the English here and the English you wrote will never be the same. Will never be the same. Because this first person writing in English is writing with everything they know about the English language. The person that you give it to will translate it according to their knowledge of English and their knowledge of Spanish. That person will give it to a third person. That person will translate it with their knowledge of Spanish and their knowledge of English. And then when you get it here, it might not be what you wrote. It could be a generally, and that's what we have in Scripture, in English and Spanish, we have a generally accepted. That's what was said. But if I had someone from the first century that knew Greek and Hebrew perfectly, if we even had a Hebrew Matthew or a Hebrew Mark, Luke, and John. It would even be easier. But we don't. And so because of that, we have what we call apparent contradictions. But they're only apparent because we don't know everything. And whether we all might be wrong, we can't be right. And so one of the most important things that we need to learn is we need to learn to study, to research. I am glad I am not where I used to be when I first began studying the Bible when I was 18, 19. I would study it, read it. I learned this. I got these books. I studied that. I went to many churches around the world, Hong Kong and in Hawaii and all kinds of places where I learned so much good stuff. I went to Bible school. I went to college or colleges, and I've studied so much. But I'm still at the point of saying, I wish I really knew. I wish I could read this scripture with the eyes of a first century person, with the understanding of a first century person. Because then apparent contradictions because of idiomatic speech or illustrations or something of those natures would not hinder us. So learning languages, learning idioms. How many idioms are we reading that we're just passing by? That we just pass by? Oh, that's a cool car. Or that's a hot car. Or, that's, a bad car. Whoever's listening, whatever language they have as their grasp, will translate those in different ways. A bad car could be a super car, or it could be a trashed out car, depending on what the person was trying to say and who he was saying it to, his audience. I would not sell an elderly person a bad car. I know this car is bad. Well, then why are you trying to sell it to me? But if a teenager says, hey, you want to buy my bad car? Oh, yeah, how much? And those are just words. And by the way, even those words change. Even the way a word is said in New England and the way something is said in California, totally different. Even in one country, among one people. So all that to say, you know what? We're coming to Passover. And these are some of the things that Adonai has taught us. Some of this stuff is since I started studying it, I've been teaching this for years and years. Other stuff every year that I get. In fact, this year I got 3 different books that I'm studying that I've never studied before from different points of view, and it's interesting. So for us here at this congregation, Passover is going to be on Saturday night. Saturday night. That is the beginning of the 14th from last Wednesday when the new year began. 14 days. The beginning of the 14th. That means that Sunday is going to be Passover day. Sunday would be the day that Yeshua would have died if it was on a Tuesday, Wednesday schedule. And then Monday morning is going to be the first day of unleavened bread, which means on Monday morning, that's the day that all the men are to muster. All the men are to come here at 9 o'clock in the morning. We'll be here. And remember what it says, do not come empty-handed, men. So every man is commanded. Again, this is not